All right, that's all from me for now. I'd love to welcome uh first time, I guess, to the live stream, Soren. If you want to turn your camera on, and then I'll kind of get off screen, and the show is yours.
Hi, all. Thanks for having me. For those of you who remember from when I was a Shy Hack Night regular, hello again. Sorry I haven't been around much the last few years. And for those of you who have no idea what I'm referring to, hello for the first time. I am an independent photographer working on projects related to the built environment, capturing images of buildings, infrastructure, and other human-made patterns around us. My work examines the ways that places are impacted by a mix of public policy, public and private investment and disinvestment, social prejudices, and individual property stewardship. I pair my photos with writing about a particular place, covering some aspect of how it evolved over time or the forces acting upon it. This work often involves digging into property records, permits, tax records, and historic contextual documents like newspapers to make sure that I'm rooting my writing in something more concrete than assumptions and anecdotes. In 2020, I launched a photo series called Leave the Seat Empty that is still ongoing. Leave the Seat Empty seeks to document buildings in Chicago after a decision has been made to tear them down, but before they are actually demolished. Demolition is a topic that's easily romanticized due to preservation and aesthetic reasons, due to personal memories associated with a place, or due to narratives of neighborhood change. A few times a year, a particularly notable demolition tends to make local news headlines, but those headline-grabbing instances of demolition aren't necessarily representative of the full landscape of demolition in Chicago. I wanted to get a more holistic view of the buildings that are torn down in Chicago, and so I set out to track demolition permits that are filed in city systems and travel to sites that were about to undergo demolition. Along the way, I researched property histories and tied those to broader economic and social patterns in our city. Here at Shy Hack Night, I'll talk about the factors that create conditions for building demolition in Chicago, the research methods I rely on to better understand demolition as a phenomenon, demolition patterns across different regions of the city, and how that all ties back to advocacy related to built environment related policy. So let's dive in. What are the factors that lead to building demolition? This is not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of some of the common things that might lead to demolition. Immediate replacement plans on a property, long-running neglect of a building, a recent disaster like a fire, the priorities of a large adjacent landholder like an industrial facility, and rich people who want side yards. The first two on this list are dominant. They're responsible for the vast majority of Chicago's demolitions. Let's talk through some examples. The largest plurality of demolition permits issued by the city each year are for projects that lead directly to new construction. This workers' cottage in Bucktown was one of three on the same block that were at one point owned by the same family, purchased by them between 1990 and 1994. This one was a single-family home, and the other two were both two-unit buildings. The family sold one of their two-unit buildings in 2004, and then sold the remaining buildings to a real estate developer in 2022 for $450,000 each. The single-family home in this photo was replaced by a new two-unit condo building, and the completed units sold for sums of $985,000 and $1.15 million. This story is somewhat typical of demolitions in wealthy neighborhoods, and especially in neighborhoods that have gone up market in recent decades. The overall gain in unit density on this site is somewhat less common, which I'll talk about later on. The second largest group of demolitions in Chicago are those which result from neglect, usually in communities that have long seen wealth and the power of local ownership get extracted from them. A nearby neighbor bought this multi-unit building in Englewood in 2005, at which time it was still habitable and actively rented to tenants, but they underwent foreclosure during the outbreak of the subprime mortgage crisis in 2007. The bank boarded up the building, and it sat vacant and unmaintained from that time forward. In 2011, a semi-anonymous business entity acquired the property, one of dozens of shell companies connected to a businessman based in suburban Oak Brook who frequently acquires vacant properties and sits on them seemingly for the purpose of land value speculation, never performing upkeep on the empty buildings he owns. The building's taxpayer information was never updated with the county, and the shell company listed its contract address as the former apartment of an employee of the building's true owner. So when the city began sending notices for violations, those notices never made their way to the building owner. Neighbors and the city could not contact the property owners to seek accountability for upkeep, which was likely by design on the property owner's part, and the structure went all the way through demolition court before being torn down by city contracted crews on a court order. The progression from foreclosure to absentee ownership to demolition is very common, especially in heavily disinvested neighborhoods where institutional owners are unlikely to be motivated to immediately sell post-foreclosure holdings, and buyers who do swoop in are often opportunistic land value speculators. Among the less common categories of demolition, disasters crop up pretty consistently, especially fires. This was one of a whole row of buildings in Fuller Park impacted by a large fire in late 2021. The city has powers to order a building demolished if it is structurally unstable following a disaster, but property owners are often allowed to keep heavily damaged buildings standing if they meet minimum standards for stability and doors and windows are swiftly boarded up. This one remained standing for about half a year before its owner moved to tear it down rather than repair or sell it. Sometimes, many buildings get demolished in a relatively short time period because of big projects from private or public actors. This home was among the last to be demolished in a large section of Englewood that was systematically cleared for expansion of a Norfolk Southern freight terminal. The railroad bought up hundreds of properties, secretly at first, to avoid rousing organized opposition from the community. Neighbors' unsuccessful fight to save their neighborhood was the subject of the 2018 documentary film The Area, directed by visual sociologist David Shalil. Between 2011 and 2021, the Norfolk Southern Terminal expansion project displaced more than 400 families and caused the closure of several churches and businesses that were either situated in the targeted section of Englewood or were close enough to see a significant decrease in visitors from the removal of so many neighbors so quickly. And then there's one other notable trend I wanted to highlight here, one that's caught the ire of many observers lately. This is one of the few properties featured in my Leave the Seat Empty series whose demolition received significant press coverage, mostly for architecture preservation reasons. The co-CEO of At Properties purchased this handsome wood frame building next to his home in Lincoln Park, as well as the next one down, and tore them both down to become a large side yard. This practice has become common in ultra-wealthy areas of Old Town and Lincoln Park, especially when the targeted properties are older vernacular multi-unit structures whose surroundings have become filled with large single-family homes in recent decades. So what does it take to actually demolish a building in Chicago? This list here is a basic rundown of a relatively complicated application, approval, and inspection process largely governed by the city's Department of Buildings. All demolition permits include a description of the demolition method, a site plan, and other required documentation. A standard demolition permit requires about 6 approvals from various city departments after it's initially filed. A more complicated one might require a dozen. Complicating factors can include known asbestos materials inside, a large or complex site, shared walls with other buildings, and various fee requirements like the 606 demolition surcharge, which is meant to disincentivize demolition of relatively affordable multi-unit buildings near the 606 bike trail, where housing prices have shifted rapidly upmarket in recent years. Some of the departments involved in these various approvals before a permit is granted include the city's Department of Housing, Water Management, Public Health, Streets and Sanitation, and Transportation. Once granted, a demolition permit requires work to start within 6 months and finish within 12 months. Now, just because all of these oversight mechanisms and extra approvals exist doesn't mean they're always effectively employed. The Hillco coal power plant smokestack demolition in 2020 became a scandal of the Lightfoot administration because property owners promised a much safer demolition than they enacted. blanketing the surrounding neighborhood in hazardous particulate matter when the smokestack came down. The photo that's behind me on the wall, and I know I'm just up in the corner here, so you won't see it in a lot of detail, is a photo of the aftermath of that demolition taken by Maclovio Orozco. Now, if you're a city agency trying to demolish something, that process looks a little bit different, and you're often able to demolish before seeking the full permit approval that a typical private landowner would. A lot of demolitions undertaken by the city fall under the category of emergency. Most commonly, emergency demolitions are the result of a demo court case when a building has been left in dangerous condition by its owner, like the abandoned apartment building in Englewood I showed a few slides back. Emergency demolitions make up about 30% of all demolition permits in a given year, and most of them are the result of a demo court case rather than a recent disaster. So, how is a member of the public supposed to know about ongoing or upcoming demolitions? Each of these on this list is a different data set on the Chicago Open Data Portal or a search tool maintained by a city or county body. Each of them captures different details about a property at different times. I'm not going to cover all of them comprehensively, but I'm happy to answer questions about any one of them after the presentation. I will go through a couple of them. This is a screenshot of the building permits dataset on the City of Chicago Open Data Portal. It updates daily with the previous day's demolition permit approvals. Other types of building permits might be updated within the same day. Permits are valid for a while after being issued, so work may not happen immediately when a permit enters this dataset. Permits that are submitted but not yet approved also don't show up in this data set, but they can be found in a separate search tool maintained by the Department of Buildings with information about their current status. This is a screenshot of the City of Chicago Vacant Buildings Registry. It's a very old site. It's barely functional. For instance, email notification features of the tool don't work properly. Either that or it just hates my email address. But this site includes case updates for buildings going through demolition court and photos from inspections. Information published here is very haphazard at times, and it can be hard to navigate if you're not in sort of the wonky mode of knowing how building inspections work and where the various responsibilities lie. But the information here is more detailed about the process leading up to demolition than the resulting demo permit is. Only a couple of these sources are available as bulk data, the two that are bolded on this list. Those are able to be exported and analyzed at scale when looking for trends in certain neighborhoods or across Chicago. The rest are single query search tools that require you to look for a specific property, a specific permit, or a specific court case, limiting our ability to interpret wide patterns from them easily. Now on this slide, this list is of data sets and tools listed providing information about what led to the demolition and what the upcoming intentions might be for the property. This is all contextualization. Once again, I'll discuss a couple of these in more detail, but not all of them. The Cook County Recorder of Deeds search tool includes property deeds, mortgages, court orders, and other legal documents related to a property going back several decades. But there are caveats on this. The office runs months behind processing and publishing new documents. So the property owner name on a demolition permit in city data is more reliable than the recorded property owner name in county records at the time that the demolition permit is issued. Also, sometimes searches in this tool can be rendered challenging because of misspellings and incomplete mappings in digitized records. This is one of two different tools published by the Cook County Assessor for searching property-related information. This is the more advanced tool. There's a sort of more user-friendly version of it also available. This captures what the county knows about the property and any building on it. The count of the number of units, its overall condition, its ownership, its assessed value. All of this is based largely on findings at the time the property was most recently assessed for tax purposes. Once again, you see in bold resources that give us access to bulk data. And in this case, there's only one of them from this list. Note the asterisk on the Secretary of State Business Entity search tool, however. That search tool can be useful for finding out more information about the owners of business entities that often hold control of properties. Illinois was required by a court a couple years ago to allow free access to bulk data about business registrations rather than just selling it to companies who would then repackage it in their own paid services. But the state has not proactively made that bulk data easy to access or view. There's a tool called DeezeGuys.com built by Anthony Moser, which helps map relationships between different Illinois business entities, their owners, the properties associated with them, and even their political donations. Anthony also maintains a tool called Better Data Portal, which is an alternative UI and search functionality for Socrata-based open data portals like Chicago's that makes it easier to find relevant information across multiple public-facing data sets. And on the subject of making all of this data easier to use, Chi-Hacknight community member Stephen Vance has long maintained a tool called Chicago Cityscape that combines data from a bunch of the sources I'm talking about here into a single website that you can search at the individual address level, the neighborhood level, and various other scales. That one's a paid service for most of its users, but it's built and maintained by a local with a lot of very good local context rather than by a big data broker. So it tends to be much more useful in Chicago's context than general purpose property research tools used by real estate developers and other related professions. Now, even if you know everywhere to look, you will not get a comprehensive picture of demolition in Chicago. The same is true of construction and renovation activity, which means that getting a clear picture of the total number of housing units in the city or changes in that unit count is genuinely impossible. Knowing the ways that public data sets skew and the different phenomena that they cover and don't cover is much more important than trying to find some sort of ground truth in a data set. Let's talk through some examples. This was an emergency demolition resulting from a demo court case. After an order of demolition is entered in the courts, it often takes years before demolition actually happens. But because emergency demolitions fall outside the usual city permit application process, they almost always take place months before a permit shows up for the work in city data. So unlike regular demolitions, new entries for emergency demolitions in the city's building permits open data set represent work that has already occurred almost all the time. This means it's impossible to look at that data set and come up with an answer to a question like, how many buildings were demolished in 2023? This pattern represents big challenges for my photo series, especially since emergency demolitions make up such a large plurality of the city's overall demolition permits. If you want to document emergency demolitions in Chicago, you basically have to know somebody who has inside knowledge about where demo crews are being assigned to work. The only places that emergency demo information sometimes show up in advance are in the Chicago Department of Public Health asbestos remediation data set, which isn't frequently updated, and in the vacant buildings registry site, which is, like I mentioned earlier, a single address query tool rather than a bulk search tool. Neither of those feature complete coverage of every building being demolished under emergency powers. In this scene, one half of what you see is a 3-unit row house from the 1880s, and the other half is another row house that originally had a mirrored 3-unit layout. At one point, it was converted into a single-family home, the one on the right. But that work doesn't show up in public data about permits. Only when the property was reassessed by the county for tax purposes did its designation change from multifamily to single-family in any public data. If you're trying to do unit count math, you'll miss a lot of information by looking exclusively at demolition, construction, and renovation data, since lots of changes fall outside that data. Often basement units are carved out of multi-unit buildings without permits. Often multi-unit buildings are converted into single-family buildings without permits. These changes sometimes show up in Cook County assessor data down the road, but reassessment only happens once every several years in any given part of the county, and certain changes don't legally count as a unit addition or subtraction, even if they're being used as such, so they may not even show up in tax assessment data. Additionally, buildings that fall into vacancy don't show up in building permit data at all because there's not work being done on them. Unit counts can change in a given area long before demolition occurs, especially when large projects are underway that involve emptying out multiple properties. This is a photo of 6 different buildings in the 100 block of East 116th Street in West Pullman that were acquired by the CTA as part of the Red Line Extension project. There are 307 subject properties that are on the acquisition list for the Red Line Extension, scattered throughout Roseland, West Pullman, and Riverdale. And those are all being acquired, all being emptied, but not yet being demolished. So that's several hundred units of housing that are disappearing from Chicago's housing landscape without showing up very clearly in data. Just like renovation activity, some demolition activity is unpermitted and won't be reflected in any public data set until reassessment for tax purposes. This here is a coach house in Fuller Park that I long had a fascination with, and I just happened to fortuitously get a photo of it a few months before it was demolished mysteriously sometime in 2021. The skew of demolition data anecdotally is better coverage of that data in neighborhoods with minimal building vacancy and worse coverage in neighborhoods with greater building vacancy. The quality of the data and its reflectiveness of reality is greater in wealthy parts of town. And then there are some true edge cases that our municipal data systems aren't fully equipped to handle. This home was abandoned in the Great Recession while partway through construction, and Chicago's Department of Buildings doesn't formally recognize it as a building. The county has reassessed the property in the time since construction activity took place, and the county notes a building on the property in their systems. But if you look up the address in the city's building permit and inspection records search tool, you won't get any results. That's because no entry was ever associated with the unfinished building in the system that underlies the search tool. So even though a building permit exists for the home from 2007, you can't get to it via the permit search tool. These challenges to the representativeness of available public data about demolition and unit count reflect challenges with open data more broadly when attempting to capture or measure real-world phenomena. For instance, building inspection data is produced by a combination of who reports violations and the social decisions that inspectors make when they find violations, which are skewed often along lines of personal sympathy or lack thereof for a given property owner. Sociologist Robin Bartram's recent book, Stacked Decks, which resulted from a period of time in which she embedded herself in the daily routines of various City of Chicago building inspectors, covers these biases in inspection practices extensively. Crime data is skewed block by block, ward by ward, and neighborhood by neighborhood via patterns in who's reporting, who believes that a report will lead to a positive outcome, and stuff like that. Plus, the whole category of crime as it shows up in report-based data sets is a constructed subset of what constitutes crime legally. Tamara Knopper gave a lecture a couple years ago titled Counting Crime that's a great starting point for examining the limitations of crime data as captured in most public record-keeping systems. Similarly, Chicago is probably not the rattiest city in the US, even though that's commonly said to be the case based on 311 data. Jake Biddle and Emily Lipstein covered the topic years ago in Southside Weekly, and Lipstein followed it up in Deadspin later on. 311 reports about rats aren't really mapping the rat population of a given neighborhood or a given city. They're mapping places where people are disturbed enough by the presence of rats to report them, which is a different thing altogether. Even sensor-based data can be skewed. For example, a truck might regularly idle under a PM 2.5 air pollution monitor for half an hour on somebody's lunch break each weekday, so that sensor's data can't be confidently extrapolated over larger areas without understanding what's happening on the ground in human terms and thinking through things when analyzing. Open data is a look into the administrative datafication of real phenomena, not a direct window into the phenomena themselves. Anecdotal observations tend to lead to myth-making, but so does pure reliance on available data. Both of them are blinded to real-world conditions in different ways. But that doesn't mean we can't make observations or draw conclusions. It just means we need to exercise care and caution when doing so. With that in mind, let's talk about some major patterns related to demolition in Chicago, born from the data and from on-the-ground experience with demolition in practice. Older vernacular multi-unit structures and single-family homes get demolished in high-investment neighborhoods, replaced by new single-family homes and low-unit count multi-unit structures that are typically more expensive per unit to buy or rent than the units that came before them. DePaul's Institute for Housing Studies has done some excellent work tracking the slow drain of relatively affordable vernacular multifamily housing from many Chicago neighborhoods in recent years. Commercial structures on big corridors like Ashland and Western see commercial redevelopment or large multifamily construction, especially at major intersections. In disinvested neighborhoods, most demolitions are a result of neglect and result in empty land, not new development, mostly an outcome of demolition court, whereas in investment-heavy neighborhoods, most demolitions come directly before new construction on the subject property. That said, in very high-end neighborhoods like Old Town and Lincoln Park, like we talked about earlier, even the biggest or prettiest or best maintained home is no match for a buyer who wants something new or who wants a side yard, especially when an oversized lot or multiple lots are available. What does that all add up to for people who might be interested in housing dynamics in the city as a function of unit count? In the available data, you'll typically find that the total number of units permitted for demolition in a given time period is approximately equal to the number of units permitted for construction in place of recently demolished properties during the same time period. The current policy and market environment around demolition has the overall effect of concentrating density along commercial corridors, but losing density on side streets. But again, a focus on demolition does not give us a full picture of unit count changes. It does not include renovations, including conversions of multifamily buildings into single-family homes, which are popular in wealthy neighborhoods. And demolition data also doesn't tell us much about development on land that was vacant for a while prior to new construction. And treating demolition or construction as one big monolithic topic for city-scale analysis can be misleading, because broad patterns and outcomes like pricing can obscure meaningful variance in those outcomes on a site-by-site basis or varying neighborhood economic conditions that feed those outcomes. Building costs are relatively fixed for similar structures built in different neighborhoods, so wide differences in resulting pricing for newly constructed housing in different areas of the city can often be explained by a combination of neighborhood demand, rent subsidies, municipal affordability requirements, and several other factors not inherent to construction itself. I want to hammer this particular point home. Outcomes are highly geographically stratified because it has strong ramifications for how we treat demolition and development in policy. This map depicts every demolition permit issued in Chicago during a one-year period between November of 2022 and November of 2023, for a total of 628 permits granted. Keep in mind that the actual dates of demolition for these properties don't necessarily align with the time frame for the permits, especially for emergency demolitions, but looking at things 12 months at a time allows us to avoid seasonal effects that can skew the data. At first, this doesn't look a whole lot like that ever-present map of Chicago that pops up everywhere, showing highly segregated outcomes in a highly segregated city. But separating out emergency demolitions, the orange triangles, from non-emergency demolitions, the purple circles, creates a rough proxy for two things: whether the targeted building was usable at the time it was demolished, and whether an immediate new use is planned for the site. This reveals a version of that inequitable map that constantly rears its head in Chicago. If we focus specifically on residential properties that underwent demolition, taking away commercial and industrial properties, since industrial zones are heavily concentrated in specific parts of the city, we get an even starker divide. In addition to demolition stratification, new construction is also similarly stratified. And big projects that add unit count, like big apartment buildings, tend to be concentrated on the north side, whereas big projects that diminish unit count, like the Norfolk Southern Yard expansion or the Red Line extension, tend to be concentrated on the south and west sides. These aren't universal truths, but they're common patterns year over year. Phenomena produced by policy, market, and social conditions are generally not simple enough to describe simply, or to confront via interventions that treat them as isolated from the other phenomena they interact with. If somebody comes to you and says something like, The city is destroying all its old buildings for these hideous new condos. They're likely reflecting on the slice of patterns that they notice in their day-to-day experience, but you should take strong normative statements like that with a grain of salt. The things we see around us aren't the full picture, and once they get processed through our value systems and priorities, they can easily come out the other side as a caricature. Impacts of built environment policy are disparate and localized based on pre-existing conditions in different parts of town. One change in policy can have very different results in different areas. And even the city itself doesn't really know the ground truth. None of us do. We have to do our best to study conditions as they occur and estimate their effects. There is no easily accessible ground truth at city scale. All of this has ramifications for the way you or I might advocate around topics like demolition or development or architecture preservation or housing affordability or residential segregation or building accessibility or any other topic that touches this facet of the built environment. There's a reason that entire fields of academic study and varied expertise exist around topics like this. There's a reason that experts are sometimes divided on interventions. Seemingly simple solutions often have severe unintended consequences, especially when they're grounded in a partial or simplified understanding of the phenomena that they wish to impact. To advocate responsibly around built environment policy is to confront complexity. Treat the administrative datafication of real-world phenomena, the data sets and resources available to you, as flawed, but potentially useful starting points. Have respect for complexity, but don't take shortcuts or fall into the trap of over-reliance on anecdotes or on data sets. But also, don't let the complexity scare you. Basically, every policy topic is just as messy as this. Being honest with ourselves about the complicated nature of the things we care about helps us be better advocates, but it's not a reason not to advocate. I appreciate your time today, and I'm happy to take some questions in the remaining time I have, but if you need to go put a child to bed or make a late dinner, here's where you can find me online. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really impressive. Clearly so much like, I mean, not only just to hear about your photography work, but to see how you've tied so much of your data background to that has been really impressive. So thank you for sharing so much about this. I definitely have some questions for you. I'll start with the first one, probably from a familiar person, from Joel Inwood.
Yeah.
Um, Joel asks, if you could change one city or county policy after working on this project for so long, what would it be?
So there's some low-hanging fruit that I know architecture preservation communities have in mind, and I want to give a shout out to some of their proposed policy interventions. We have very, very toothless architecture preservation laws in this city, and that's not purely something that exists on aesthetic or historic value grounds. It's something that impacts things like demolition of vernacular multifamily structures that are then replaced by much more expensive single-family homes. There are affordability ramifications to this. And in Chicago, basically, there's no way to prevent demolition of a given building unless that building is landmarked. It is very, very, very hard to prevent demolition of a building if a property owner wants to demolish it. We have various gradings for how historically important a given building is. They're assigned color grades, but unless your building has gotten city council approval to be a landmark, which is a whole process and a very small list of buildings, those color gradings only result in a delay in demolition to give advocates time to argue for a different path. There's no more teeth than that. Now, that was a shout out to communities that I know care about the preservation side of things a lot. I am a real big fan of some interventions that have been proposed by Robin Bartram, the sociologist who wrote Stacked Decks based on her experience embedded in Chicago's building inspections teams. She saw firsthand that often the remedies that are available to building inspectors, even when they're trying really, really hard to ensure justice and equity in outcomes, they come too late. And really, a policy that would keep buildings in active service and in safe service for people is a policy that starts giving people more resources for upkeep earlier rather than reacting to violations with fines and court cases and so on. And there are some city programs around that. There's a porch and roof repair program that was recently expanded into a general repair program, but they're very small compared to the level of need. It's very hard to get into those programs, especially for low income property owners.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Another audience question is why do deconversions happen and why
Yeah.
do you choose to skip or use permitting?
So deconversions. Let me de-jargonify that for a second. I think I did use it a couple times during the presentation. So when you've got a multi-unit building, especially these are most commonly like a vernacular 2-unit building in Chicago, one of those classic brick or gray stone or wood frame 2-unit buildings, and somebody converts it into a single family home. Most often, this happens in areas that are becoming increasingly wealthy. So one of the epicenters of deconversion activity in Chicago is the neighborhood of North Center, which has a couple of elementary schools that are very, very beloved and that people really want their kids to be able to get into. And you have a lot of families with a lot of money that are interested in living in that neighborhood. And they might like value that the building is old and pretty and it suits the block and so on, but they want a larger space and they've got the money to make it a larger space. So deconversions largely happen because you have a combination of over time, Americans have taken up more space in their housing than they used to. This is another sort of element of this. I live in a 1,000 square foot home that in 1920 was home to 12 people. And that seems almost unfathomable today, but it was closer to normal at that time. And the other element of it is just immense new investment in certain neighborhoods. Now, deconversion often happens in a permitted fashion. Often people will apply for permits, they'll have an architect, they'll be doing it the right way. Deconversion can happen without permits for a few reasons. Sometimes somebody doesn't really care to reconfigure the space so much. Like the kitchen in one unit of the building might be useful to have might be useful to have a kitchen on both floors, or they just have somebody who's a handyman or a contractor who will rip out that kitchen, put up some walls or make it an office space, and hey, it's done. But often the administrative burdens of like seeking a permit are a turnoff for people who want to do work, and that applies to any type of work. It applies to day-to-day repairs, it applies to roofing, it applies to any sort of renovations, but it is something that happens with deconversions where they can happen without people without the city being aware that they're happening.
Interesting. All right, let's keep going. Another one. I've noticed on Chicago's cityscape that many emergency demolitions are owned by the city. Is it inevitable that a city-owned house becomes vacant?
Well, there's several complicated paths to a property becoming city owned, and usually what happens is the property has already been long vacant by the time it becomes city owned. The city ends up in possession of properties because people fall behind on their taxes, and sometimes that is due to financial hardship, but sometimes it's due to somebody with a large portfolio of distressed properties that they're sitting on for speculative reasons, just not keeping up with their portfolio. Sometimes it happens because somebody in the family dies and nobody is really in a position to take over their assets, but either like an estate isn't opened or like that property just sort of passes out of active stewardship. So I would say like in the framing of that question of is it inevitable that when the city owns a property it becomes vacant? You got to flip that. The
Hmm,
property is usually distressed long before the city comes into the picture.
hmm, interesting. Another question. The total energy cost almost never lands on the side of demolition. Retrofit Chicago never really went anywhere. How can we begin to tell this story?
Yeah, so I will caveat here. not my area of expertise, but it is an emerging topic in demolition conversations and architecture preservation conversations. Embodied carbon in buildings. It takes a lot of new materials, new manufactured materials to build a new building. And the most efficient new building in the world may take quite a while still to make up for the overall carbon impact of the process that went into building it, not to mention the process of demolishing whatever came before it. So there's a lot of advocacy now for being able to green retrofit existing vernacular housing. I think it's a worthwhile conversation, and I think one that I'm not necessarily at the center of, but which groups like Preservation Chicago are starting to find their way with people who are really interested in green building topics. And I would pay close attention to what they're saying.
Awesome. What are your thoughts on neighborhoods pushing for historic status to avoid development of high-rise residential structures? Where is the line drawn? Old Town comes to mind.
Yeah, this is development topics are complicated topics because the impacts of new development are both very emotional and often very contested in academic spaces, even in spaces that study this full time. Now, what I'll say is, generally speaking, the Old Town project in question is, in my opinion, fantastic. It's taking a commercial property, building hundreds of new homes on it. We have an immense concentration of demand for housing on the North Lakefront that is driving prices wild. And most scholarship suggests that you can ease pressure on pricing by having a relatively easy process to build a large number of new units. I live in a designated city historic district. I can see a lot of the value that people see in it. But for me personally, at the end of the day, if I was in a neighborhood like Old Town, I know the triangle is protected and has pretty strict definitions around it. But what's around that is less strictly protected and should be less strictly protected. The triangle is like, here's what Chicago looked like in 1870, 1880, I guess, not 1870, because there was a fire.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because there is a lot of sort of contested scholarship on this. But generally, I'm a fan of new housing, and I'm especially a fan of new housing, and this wasn't part of the question here, but I'm especially a fan of new housing when there are municipal guarantees of affordable unit requirements within that new housing. If we can use large housing development to spur development of guaranteed affordable units, that helps take price pressure off immensely price pressured neighborhoods like Old Town, Lincoln Park, Lakeview, North Center, etc.
All right, and this is probably our last question. Alexei Janulius had campaigned on tech modernization of the Secretary of State's office. With your work, have you seen signs that this is actually happening?
I don't interact with every digital tool of the Secretary of State's office. I have seen several of the Secretary of State's office search tools get, at the very least, like reskinned in an interface that's more pleasing. And when I say more pleasing, I don't mean that in kind of like a talk down to it sense of they just put lipstick on it. No, I mean a good UI can be genuinely easier to use and can get people access to public information more easily. I won't comment far beyond that because I use city data and county data a lot more than I use state level data.
Totally fair. All right, well, that's all the questions we have. We're at 8 p.m. Soren, thank you so much again. I know if you could hear our YouTube audience right now, it'd be rapturous applause. But thank you so much. This is a really great presentation. And I know you know how we have to end.
Yes.
So maybe before we get there, Josh, if you want to just throw up that link really quick. Oh, I'm looking at it's already up. I was looking at the wrong, sorry. So remember, everyone, please hop onto the Zoom link right there. And yeah, without further ado, we'll just say go forth and hack. All right. So
Let's
three,
go
two,
forth and
one, go
go
forth
forth
and
and
hack.
hack.
See you, everybody.